You and his new bro Chacho have had some words in the past on Twitter. And what do you make of this newfound bromance between the love of your life and someone that you really didn't seem to get along with very
I think one of Adam's fatal flaws is he's too trusting. He's too optimistic. He sees the best in everything and everyone, and that's wonderful. And I wish I was more like that. But you also have to be realistic and realize sometimes there are giant pieces of shit out there that disguise themselves in a Burberry scarf. On the other side, what better way to get all the TV time in the world than to put yourself with MJF? So I'm very happy for him in that sense because I mean MJF's face is all over AEW. So if that's gonna mean Adam's face is all over AEW too, I support that. But I just want him to have his guard up at all.
It's August 2nd, 2024, and an interesting story has slipped out of the AEW locker room. Apparently, Britt Baker got into some type of altercation with Alicia Atout, which led to MJF punching a wall. We're going to go through this, and we're going to talk about what I believe is the reasoning for it. The too long didn't listen is I believe that Britt Baker is insanely jealous of the amount of time MJF gets on AEW TV. We'll get into that into a second. So Wrestling Observer Newsletter put out the story. Britt Baker was suspended for 1 or 2 weeks and fined by the company's disciplinary committee. The details are this. It says the details have been pretty quiet. It came from something backstage at the July 17th Dynamite where Baker allegedly said something about MJF and Alicia Atout. MJF's girlfriend heard it and told him, and he confronted Baker. This led to an investigation with HR talking to people on July 24th. And I believe the disciplinary committee that did the investigation recommended that. He begins to editorialize here by saying, I don't know if Tony Khan was or wasn't involved in this, and everyone was attempting to keep this under wraps. This all stems from problems in the past that weren't addressed, and a committee was put together to settle these things quickly. Many of those we heard from were sympathetic to her in this situation. Her, of course, being Britt Baker. Now, there's several different versions of this story that has been floating around. The original version of the story that I saw was similar to the one Meltzer put out there, but Fightful also did some reporting on this argument that said, and this is going to be from somebody that is relaying Fightful's information. It says several weeks ago, an argument between MJF and Britt Baker occurred backstage. The word internally was that Baker exercised frustration about MJF within the women's locker room, and word made it back to MJF as his girlfriend Alicia Atout was in the room. The details are he said, she said, but Baker took issue with Atout telling MJF, and there was a claim from one person that Baker cursed at Atout. An argument broke out between MJF and Baker, which resulted in MJF punching a wall before his match against Will Ospreay. AEW HR got involved in the situation and suspended Baker. An investigation was conducted, and numerous members of the roster and suspension was levied. There were other bits and pieces that came out after that, but that's the general idea, is that Britt Baker made a comment in the women's locker room about MJF, and this comment was overheard by his girlfriend Alicia Atout, who then relayed it to MJF. He came to confront Britt Baker about it, and that seems to be where we are right now. Even going so far, if from my understanding, that MJF actually went into the women's locker room to confront her about this. Now, there's of course the question of if MJF went into the women's locker room in order to have an argument with Britt Baker, why wasn't he punished? There apparently was no answer to that question, except for it seems that Britt Baker is going to be the one taking all the heat for this. Now, hey, Jolly Mongo is kind of like, hey, CM Punk can't blame him for this one, and Britt Baker's been a consistent problem. in the locker room. She is, for all intents and purposes, the Mercedes Moné of AEW. Now, this doesn't in any way excuse MJF's behavior. If he went into the women's locker room, and even if it was just punching a wall, you do have to see that as not only a sign of frustration, but in some ways a sign of escalation. You can't have a guy barge into the women's locker room, punching the wall, screaming and yelling, which I'm going to assume was all that was occurring, was everybody yelling at each other. But I'm going to really talk about why I think this occurred. See, Britt Baker, in two different interviews, one with Wrestling of Barstool Sports and another with Steven Muehlhausen, in both interviews, which were around, I believe was All In. Well, one of them was when MJF was wrestling Danielson. I'm not sure when that was. The Steven Muehlhausen one was around All In, which was last year. And in both instances, she mentioned something that was actually occurring at the Dynamite 250 or the July 17th show. And that is that MJF gets a lot of TV time. Now, it was legitimately mentioned that this is a good way, I believe she said in the Steven Muehlhausen conversation, that a good way for Adam Cole to get on television is to be involved with MJF, because MJF is all over AEW's television. That was a snide remark that she made that some people could just kind of hand wave as being, oh, she's in character, it's a joke, it's a work, yada, yada, yada. On the Steven Muehlhausen, the Wrestling Barstool podcast, she was talking about Bryan Danielson and MJF, and she mentioned MJF doing 30-minute promos about his life and all this sorts of thing. So the amount of time being given to MJF is a sore subject for Britt Baker. And when you look at, she just returned from a sabbatical she was out for like a year, and she comes back, MJF comes back, he starts getting TV time again. They start investing a lot of TV time into him again. He's getting 20-minute promos again. And then the day of the argument, now this was supposedly before he went out and wrestled Will Ospreay, right? So what was likely to have occurred? My thought process on this is that Britt Baker found out that Will Ospreay and MJF was about to eat up an hour of Dynamite. She went back into the women's locker room and complained about it. Alicia Toot heard it, went to MJF, told him about it. He then comes into the women's locker room, yelled at her about it, punched the wall as they were arguing, and then he went out and had his match. Now, the question of why Britt Baker was suspended, well, if you look in AEW's handbook, they do have a clause, basically a non-disparagement clause in the handbook. It's actually part 4 or bullet point 4, public criticism of fellow team members. It says AEW policy prohibits public criticism of fellow team members, such as prohibited public statements may include but are not limited to accusations or criticism of fellow team members or the organization as a whole, accusation or criticism of tactics, style of wrestling of fellow team members, accusations or suggestions that certain issues consistently occur in a particular match. Then there's other things such as innuendos and indirect statements will also be considered prohibited. While understanding that social media can be used to help advance storylines, first please check with those with whom you are working before posting. So if you look at this, the non-disparagement, it depends on what she said about MJF. And since they only know what she said, it might have fallen under the non-disparagement clause, that she disparaged MJF in some way, and he had a fit about it. Now, most people will look at this situation and say, it's incredibly petty and it's incredibly immature. Britt Baker's in her 30s. MJF is almost 30. They've been working together for 5 years. What kind of issues could they still have with one another that has not been hashed out? And my thing is, you can't hash out envy. If somebody is jealous of somebody else, the amount of time that they get, the amount of money or interest that the company is investing in them, you can't hash that out. There's not really much you can do. There's no real cure for jealousy. There's no real cure for envy. There's no real cure for that. Therefore, the best you can do is try to keep the people apart, or you have to do what Mercedes did, and she's going to have to leave. Now, this is the reason why I say that she's the Mercedes Moné of AEW, because this is a consistent thing with Mercedes when she was on SmackDown. She was just jealous of the amount of time Roman Reigns was getting. And I've read passages before of, Mercedes saying that she needs the same amount of time as Roman Reigns because she's just as big a star. And now Britt Baker is pretty much, you can infer, I guess you could say, that she has the same idea about her and MJF, that if you invested all that time in me, I would be just as big a star too if I got to do 30-minute promos, if I got an hour-long match, etc. And there's nothing AEW can do about that outside of either do it or humble her to the degree that she stops thinking that about herself. And that's typically seen as a very negative thing, but there's a lot of negativity about Britt Baker in general, from the Thunder Rosa stuff, from the Lufisto stuff, and she came out and did a victory lap after this whole thing. We'll talk about that in a second. But Britt Baker just seems like a shit stirrer. Now, in this situation, she was expressing some frustration. Who knows what the situation was? She was talking to somebody else, and then Alicia overheard it or not. But that seems to really be the crux of the issue here. Alicia Toot's only been in the company a couple of weeks. I think she's been signed as a backstage interviewer only around the same amount of time as Britt Baker's return on the roster. So maybe about 3 weeks, maybe 4 weeks. And if she's already starting trouble, are we in a position really to keep her around? She hasn't done much of anything. I would imagine the only reason she even got hired in the first place is because she's MJF's pillow. So I don't understand how she could be in the middle of this, and everybody just kind of was like, oh, MJF, he's a pervert. He went into the locker room and he was punching the wall. He's got anger issues. Oh, Britt Baker, she's a bully. She was bullying Thunder Rosa. She, said she may have bullied Lufisto or maybe bullied some other people. And the person that's missing right here in the middle is MJF doesn't know what the fuck Britt Baker is talking about in that locker room. If it wasn't for Alicia Toot gossiping and running and telling him. Now, some people will say, well, it's her boyfriend. What can you do? Of course, if somebody's talking about your mate behind his or her back, but at the same time, do you really want to be the reason why there's a big blow up in the locker room? And now she is. Now she's the big reason that there's a fight in the locker room, or an argument. I'm pretty sure it wasn't a fight. And who knows how that could rub off on Adam Cole, how that could rub off on other people who might have been involved. And it does a disservice to what AEW is trying to put forward in terms of the harmony in their locker room. Because it seems like the call was coming from inside the house the whole time. When CM Punk was being made to look like the bad guy, we saw that it was the Elite the whole time. Now, from the women's side, where we've been told it was Britt Baker for a long time, most people were just kind of like, yeah, but she's got a lot of talent. And then as soon as she comes back, there's an issue. You do have to ask the question, however, if she wasn't already booked to wrestle Mercedes at All In, would she even still be around? Would they have benched her for even longer? It seemed like a 1 week suspension seems about fair for this. Maybe, I think it's a 1 or 2 weeks, so who knows how long the suspension is, but she's not going to miss the pay-per-view. And maybe you should have done something to MJF, at least a fine for going into the women's locker room and causing a stir. But you're looking at this situation and you're saying to yourself, you got this new girl in the locker room. She's already going to be ostracized now. She put herself in a real terrible position because Alicia now can't go into that locker room anymore because the other girls have seen that she's going to run her mouth and it's going to be a problem. So if I was her, I wouldn't even want to work there anymore. I'd just leave. It's not really worth it at this point. You're going to lose the trust of the other girls in the locker room, and that camaraderie is already poisoned. If you assume that a lot of the people in the locker room are going to be friendly with Britt Baker, then you're going to say, how friendly are they going to be to you now that you've caused this situation and you've cost her money and opportunities, etc. But that's just the way I would think about things. I don't know if she would be too popular in the locker rooms anymore. But Lufisto, she tweeted out, "A year ago today, I shared my story, what I had seen, heard, experienced, noticed. It messed up a huge part of my life and my health. My fault. I can't shut up when I feel something needs to be said. That's on me. However, the biggest lesson I learned that day, loyalty, values, and integrity stop where the fear of never having or losing your spot begins." It was an interesting point, a very poignant point, that Britt Baker is under a lot of pressure. She's being brought in to wrestle with the shiny new toy. She got to be the good girl in this situation because Mercedes is also temperamental and likely to throw a fit and quit and cry and bemoan her treatment in AEW. So you have a landmine of super emotional and sensitive people being forced to work together, most of whom are never really been professionals in the first place. They're still learning on the job. And then you have certain temperamental, emotionally disturbed veterans coming into the locker room. And those people are also not very mature. And it is interesting that Tony Khan has found no way to fix this problem. Now, I don't expect him to be a miracle worker. Again, there's no cure for envy. There's no cure for jealousy. And I think at the end of the day, between Britt Baker and MJF, all this is jealousy. And my crowning and final point on this was in an interview that Britt Baker did in 2022. She said that she is more valuable than MJF. Her exact words were, "Honestly, I am worth more than Max. If you owned a wrestling company in today's landscape or climate, is MJF worth more money or is Britt Baker worth more money? Me and Max have these conversations with each other all the time. We're very competitive. He thinks he's more important. I think I'm more important. I built an entire women's division from the ground up." You can't fix this. All right? This is a routine thing with her. If they're competing against each other for whatever reason, maybe it was friendly, but now it's getting kind of personal. You can't fix this. Once there has been a seed of jealousy and envy, and it has been planted within the heart of a person, it's very difficult to get that out. I've been on this channel a lot talking about things like socialism and Marxism, which is the political ideology of jealousy. Somebody has more than me. That shouldn't be. They're stealing from me. They're taking something from me. Instead of they earned it, and you should pursue righteousness and try to earn that as well. That's not how she's looking at it. She's looking at it from the perspective of they're giving all this stuff to MJF. They're basically taking it from me, giving it to him. Who would you rather invest in? That was the quote, is who would you rather invest in? Giving you this false binary, forcing you as the person who will own the company to make a decision about who you would invest your time and efforts and energy in. And the fact that she sees all this stuff going to MJF, it rankles something within her. You can't fix that. There's no way for you as a boss to be able to fix that problem. That's something where she probably needs some therapy. All right, like seriously. That stuff is a cancer within people. And you can see how it happens, how it's been going on throughout the entire time. Intensely jealous people tend to be like this. They develop a victim mentality. And then in some instances, when they are victimized or when they are chastised for their misbehavior, they take that as justification of the victimization. In other words, when Sasha Banks would complain about how she should get more time or whatever, she would pitch a bitch. She would throw a tantrum. She would want to go on. She would quit. She would try to resign or whatever. And then if they would suspend her or if they would talk to her harshly, she would then run into the internet and say, "I don't like how they were treating me. I don't like how they were talking about me." But you missed all the stuff where she was bringing this on herself through her own jealousy, through her own entitlement, through her own, brattiness. She was causing a lot of her own issues, and she didn't see that. Britt Baker is doing the exact same thing. A lot of the heat that's falling on Britt Baker is Britt Baker's own doing. It's her running her mouth, shooting off her mouth when she don't have to. If she's frustrated, if she thinks that, Tony Khan is making a bad decision by investing in MJF rather than her, the best way to handle that is when your contract is up, you say, I'm out of here. You don't value me. You don't value what I do. I'm out of here. I mean, MJF just did that, right? When he saw that CM Punk and all these guys were making more money than him, he pitched a bitch about it. He made a big deal about it. But when his contract was coming up, that's when he did something. That's when he finally stepped in and was like, you know what? You're going to pay for it. All the time that you put me second, all the time that you paid people more than me, despite the fact that I was on TV more, higher up on the card and doing more, it's going to start coming out of your pocketbook. It's what Sasha Banks went through for a while when Vince was there, right? She would get pissy. She would get an attitude. Vince would give her some money. Here, go away. And she would be happy with that. Hey, I'm okay. He just gave me some money. I'm cool. Tony Khan needs to, and that's a Band-Aid. Again, you can't cure this stuff. It's a Band-Aid to just give people something and tell them to go away. Because it's just going to come back up again later, which it always did with Sasha Banks, which it continues to do with Britt Baker. That's why the wording of the initial reporting is so important. That it was something that was not hashed out a long time ago. Because they already knew this situation was going on between MJF and Britt Baker. They didn't do anything about it. They let it fester. The best thing you can do, and I don't know what her contract looks like, and I'm not saying fire her. I'm saying the best thing Britt Baker can do is probably ask to leave if she doesn't like the way she's being treated. Or if her contract is going to come up soon, who knows, because she might have time added for the injuries that she was on. She might need to look into free agency and just take a walk. Because if you feel so deeply that the company doesn't value you, despite the fact that they invested a lot of time and energy into you, if you feel like it should have been more, then you certainly need to go out, start all over again. Prove that you were right and that you were the right choice and that the company should have invested all their time and energy into you. Look at Cody. Cody did that. Like, share, subscribe. I'll talk to you guys later.
MJF is the world champ. Do you think there's a chance he ever shuts up?
Listen, I am praying that Bryan Danielson wins this match for the sole fact that there's a small chance then that we won't have 30-minute MJF promos every freaking week. Like, my brain is melting hearing all his weird stories from when he was a kid. Like, what is wrong with this guy? But I think that's going to be
skin tone, so why attach yourself and piggyback the wealth you didn't earn or lack yourself? I'm telling you to own up to your own success and failures. It's a reason why these sleazy